If you think about the major political shocks we've seen recently, I'm talking about the 2016 US election or the Brexit vote. What's the go-to explanation?
That's always economics.
It's always economic distress,
Sure.
job losses, inequality. That's what we assume drives people to want radical change.
Right. The standard story.
But here's a question to kick off our deep dive today. If it was only about economic hardship, why did these movements get so much support in countries that were, well, relatively stable at the time?
Or even recovering.
Exactly. What if the real dividing line, the critical fault line, is actually cultural, not economic?
And that is precisely the argument in the book we're summarizing today.
It is. The book is Cultural Backlash: Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart. And it's this massive, data-driven study that suggests the big political fight right now isn't rich versus poor. It's social liberals versus social conservatives.
And with this, we want you to discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Now, unlike a previous review, which might offer a focused analysis, this feature delivers a really comprehensive overview. We're tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject.
We really hope you appreciate this expanded format. If you find it helpful, please let us know. Your feedback is what will shape future content.
So our mission is to give you a full summary of the book's argument. We're going to move from theory to the evidence and then to how it all plays out in actual elections.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
Okay, so let's start with the core thesis, this cultural cleavage.
The central idea here really starts decades ago with something Inglehart originally called the Silent Revolution. Can you set the stage for us? What was that revolution?
The Silent Revolution is this long-term shift in values that started in advanced societies really after World War II. Once entire generations grew up without having to worry constantly about simple survival, things like daily hunger or just physical safety, their priorities began to change.
They shifted.
They moved from what the authors call materialist values, so economic security, law and order, to post-materialist values.
So it's a move away from how do I get my next meal to questions about quality of life.
Precisely. Post-materialist values are all about self-expression, protecting the environment, human rights, gender equality, a more cosmopolitan outlook. And this was driven mainly by younger, more educated people.
But the critical point of this book is that this revolution, it didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. It provoked a powerful counter-revolution.
The cultural backlash of the title.
Exactly. This huge social and moral change created a backlash among groups who were and are deeply attached to traditional norms. For them, things like open borders, feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, it all feels like an existential threat.
A threat to their national identity, their way of life.
Yes, a threat to the social order they grew up in. So their reaction is to defend cultural homogeneity, traditional hierarchy.
I understand that, but what about the economic pain that we know is real? Stagnant wages, jobs moving overseas. The authors can't just ignore that, can they?
But they're very careful about this. They absolutely acknowledge that economic grievances matter, but they see them mainly as accelerants.
As catalysts.
Right. They're not the root cause. The deep-seated divide that's now politically central is cultural. Economic anxiety might make someone look for a strong leader, but their actual demands, which are often anti-immigrant, socially conservative, those are rooted in cultural values.
That's a great distinction. It's the difference between the match and the fuel. Okay, for us to really get this, we need to define some key terms the book uses. Let's start with populism.
Populism is defined really minimally. It's mostly a style of rhetoric, not a specific set of policies. It's a claim about where power should lie.
And what is that claim?
That legitimate authority rests only with the people, who are seen as a pure, unified group, and stands against a corrupt, self-serving, distant elite.
So it's that us versus them rhetoric, the people versus the establishment.
Exactly. Anytime a politician says the system is rigged or the media and the experts are all wrong, only I speak for the true forgotten majority, that's the populist style they're describing.
And when you mix that populist style with those conservative cultural values we talked about, you get what the book calls authoritarian populism. So what defines those specific authoritarian values?
They cluster around three main ideas. First is a huge priority on security protection from disorder, from outside threats.
Okay.
Second is a demand for conformity to traditional norms, a real resistance to social change. And third is a preference for obedience to strong, decisive leaders who promise to defend the in-group.
And the book's argument is that when these two forces combine, that's when liberal democracy gets into trouble.
Absolutely. When authoritarianism and populism merge, the political project that's formed tends to erode liberal democratic norms. That's when you see challenges to minority rights, less tolerance for diversity, and attacks on institutions like the courts or the press.
It changes politics from a debate into a battle between the pure people and the traitors.
Precisely.
All right, that's a really powerful theory. But this is political science, so they need the data. Let's move from the theory in part 1 of the book to the evidence in part 2, where they use massive data sets like the World Values Survey.
Right. They had to prove this cultural cleavage actually exists and is maybe growing. And the data really does document this generational split. It shows the post-materialist values are expanding among the young, which then triggers this authoritarian reflex among traditionalists.
The ones who feel their world is slipping away.
Exactly. The differences in views on things like gender roles, diversity, or authority are just stark when you break it down by age and education.
And this is where the book really goes head-to-head with that default economic story. They test whether economic factors like actual job loss or inequality can explain things better than the cultural story. What did they find?
This finding is so crucial. It reframes the whole role of economics. Economic grievances are definitely real, but statistically, they're secondary. More importantly, when people feel economic anxiety, it doesn't automatically make them want a traditional left-wing socialist solution.
What does it do instead?
It reinforces their underlying need for order and security.
So an economic downturn doesn't just make them angry, it makes them more receptive to authoritarian messages.
You've got it. It amplifies their cultural conservatism. Economic fear makes them prioritize those traditional, security-focused values, which then boost their support for populist leaders who promise a return to an orderly, secure past.
The culture is the foundation, and the economic fear is the accelerant.
That's the argument.
Let's drill down on the most potent cultural issue here: immigration. The conventional wisdom is that support for anti-immigrant parties is highest where immigration is highest. Does the data actually bear that out?
Not really, and that's one of the book's biggest contributions. They analyze attitudes toward diversity and find that the strongest correlation isn't with actual exposure to immigrants. So, not how many immigrants live in your town.
But with what?
With symbolic fears about national identity and cultural cohesion.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying the people most anxious about immigration might be living in the most homogenous areas?
That is the paradox the data points to. For many, the fear isn't based on their daily interactions. It's based on a perception that their way of life is under threat, a perception often driven by media and political rhetoric.
So it's the symbolic fear of losing cultural control that really drives support for these politics.
Overwhelmingly so.
This complexity, moving beyond simple economic determinism to analyze these deep cultural values, really requires a lot of context. And look, if you appreciate this kind of comprehensive breakdown of dense literature, you should know about Mindful Moments.
That's our YouTube channel.
It is. It offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought, and it's really valuable for aspiring authors, too.
Okay, so we've established the cultural cleavage. Part 3 of the book then looks at how these values actually translate into votes. How do they profile the typical authoritarian populist voter?
The profile is remarkably consistent across Western democracies. It really comes down to 3 things: older age, lower levels of formal education, and critically strong social conservatism.
These culturally conservative groups, who are often, but not always, working class, are just consistently overrepresented among the supporters of these parties.
For them, politics is less about economics and more about defending cultural boundaries.
Right. But the political system itself has to matter, doesn't it? It's not just about the voters. It's about how votes become power.
It matters immensely. The book talks a lot about the institutional context, electoral rules, voting thresholds, the party system. All of this can either amplify the cultural backlash or dampen it.
How so?
Well, if a system makes it easy for small parties to get into government, it amplifies the effect. If you have a rigid two-party system, it might suppress it at first, but then the cultural fight just happens inside the major parties.
Which is sort of what we saw in the U.S.
Exactly. Let's turn to the case studies, starting with Trump's America in 2016. How does this cultural theory explain that result better than the economic one?
The book's analysis is very clear on this. While economic distress was there, Trump's support was most strongly associated with measures of authoritarian and ethno-nationalist attitudes.
More than job loss.
Statistically, yes. When they ran the models, things like anti-immigrant sentiment, racial resentment, and a desire for a strong leader were more powerful predictors of a Trump vote than objective economic data. It connects directly to America's long, complicated history with cultural and racial conflict.
So the slogan, Make America Great Again, wasn't just about jobs. It was about nostalgia for a specific cultural order that many felt was gone.
It was a promise to restore a traditional cultural hierarchy. And the other huge case study, the one that's really central to the book, is Brexit.
A fascinating case because the economic arguments against leaving were so overwhelming and yet it passed.
This is where the cultural cleavage argument really shines. Support for leave was strongest among voters who were older, less educated, and very socially conservative. And remember that paradox we talked about?
About immigration.
Yes. The analysis found leave support was strongest in areas that were often the least exposed to recent immigration, but where anxiety about national identity and sovereignty was the highest.
So it wasn't about the reality on the ground. It was anxiety about the idea of losing a British identity to a sort of vague, multicultural Europe.
Exactly. The Leave campaign expertly framed Brexit not as an economic choice, but a cultural one, a victory for ordinary, decent people against those unaccountable elites in Brussels. It mobilized that deep cultural conservatism far more effectively than any economic argument could.
So moving into the final section of the book, what are the broader consequences of this?
Well, Norris and Inglehart show that these patterns appear wherever these authoritarian populist parties get a foothold. And what's often missed is the power that even small parties can have through this kind of cultural leverage.
What do you mean? How can a small party that only gets, say, 10% of the vote change everything?
They exert what the authors call blackmail pressure. Even if they don't win, they force mainstream parties to adopt their policies, especially on immigration and nationalism, to avoid losing those culturally conservative voters.
Like UKIP in the UK.
A perfect example. UKIP never governed, but they were the reason the Conservative Party was pressured into holding the referendum in the first place. They completely reshaped the UK's political agenda.
This sounds like more than just a normal political shift. What does it do to the system as a whole?
The book gets into that in the final chapters. They detail an erosion of civic culture. They find that the rise of authoritarian populism correlates with a measurable drop in public trust in key democratic institutions.
Like parliaments, the courts.
The press. And it also correlates with a weakening of basic civic norms, like tolerance for minority viewpoints across several established democracies.
That's a sobering thought. We're not just talking about parties changing, but the fundamental operating system of democracy being altered. What's the final takeaway?
The ultimate conclusion is that the main challenge to liberal democracy isn't just populism. Criticizing elites can be healthy. It's specifically the authoritarian variant.
When leaders claim they have a monopoly on the will of the people.
Right. When they bypass checks and balances and try to delegitimize any and all opposition, that's when the basic safeguards of liberal democracy, minority rights, independent institutions come under enormous strain. They argue this cultural backlash is the most potent threat to pluralism today.
Why?
Because it's rooted in these deep-seated values that are incredibly hard to change through policy alone.
So, to wrap this up, the authors really leave us with a challenge. How should democratic leaders and citizens respond? It seems it requires tackling both the real economic problems and engaging with these deep cultural anxieties that are fueling this entire dynamic. Simply ignoring the cultural divide is no longer an option.
A difficult balance to strike.
It is. For a deeper analysis of the book's methods and its impact, click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. And please, subscribe, share this deep dive, purchase the book with our link, and always think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.